Jennifer Rose, 52, walked along the narrow roadside, wrapping her old woolen scarf tighter around her. The gray morning, cold November wind, and fine rain that seemed intent on seeping under her clothes added to her depressed state. Over the past 2 years, her life had turned into a series of disappointments, each leaving its painful mark. Divorce from her husband, Douglas, a falling out with her younger daughter, Emily, who had gone away to study and barely called anymore, and a constant feeling that she was left alone in this world. Today, Jennifer decided to walk to the store. Usually, she drove her old car, but it had broken down again, and there was no money for repairs. Slowly moving her feet, she tried to focus on simple thoughts. How much bread costs, whether she had remembered to take her wallet. But her inner voice, which hadn't quieted for the past few months, began to torment her again. How did you end up like this? Where did you go wrong? The road was deserted. Only occasional cars sped by, leaving a trail of dirty splashes. Suddenly, up ahead, slightly off to the side, she noticed a dark silhouette at the very edge of the road. At first, Jennifer thought it was just a plastic bag that the wind had blown into the ditch, but as she approached, her heart stopped. In the mud, curled into a tiny ball, lay a puppy. Its thin, dirt-covered body barely moved, and one ear was caked with dried blood. Jennifer squatted down, not thinking about the cold ground, and carefully reached out her hand. "Oh, poor thing," she whispered softly, feeling a wave of pity and horror rise in her chest. The puppy opened its eyes, and in that gaze mixed pain and fear, but also a hint of hope. It whimpered softly, as if asking for help. Jennifer quickly took off her scarf and gently wrapped it around the puppy. Her hands trembled not only from the cold, but also from the realization that if she left it here, it would simply die. "Everything will be okay, little one. I promise," she said, picking up the tiny body and pressing it to herself. For a moment, she froze, looking around, as if trying to figure out what to do next. In her head, thoughts swirled. Where is the nearest vet clinic? How much will it cost? She couldn't afford an extra dollar, but leaving this puppy to die was unthinkable. Jennifer started walking back home. The cold wind burned her face, but she no longer noticed it. Each step felt heavy, as if the responsibility for this tiny creature physically weighed on her. When she finally returned to her house, old, slightly dilapidated, but cozy, she immediately went to the kitchen. Carefully placing the puppy on a soft blanket she had taken from the closet, Jennifer began looking for something to treat its wounds. In her first aid kit, she found only hydrogen peroxide, bandages, and an old tube of ointment. "You're strong, right? You'll make it," she said, soothing the puppy as she carefully cleaned its wounds. Its body was emaciated, ribs clearly visible under the thin fur. But even in this state, it weakly wagged its tail, as if wanting to show gratitude. As she treated its paw, Jennifer couldn't help but wonder how it ended up here. Too small to survive on its own. Maybe someone deliberately threw it on the roadside? This thought sparked a flash of anger she hadn't felt in a long time. How could someone be so cruel? After treating the wounds, Jennifer wrapped the puppy in a warm blanket and placed a bowl of water next to it. She sat on a chair, and for the first time in a long while felt tears welling up in her eyes. "You didn't just appear for no reason, did you?" she said softly, looking at it. "Maybe you were sent to remind me that life can still be good." The puppy whimpered softly, and Jennifer felt something in her heart beginning to change. This tiny bundle of life she had saved had unexpectedly become a symbol of something greater, perhaps a chance for a new beginning. She realized that her journey was just beginning. That night, Jennifer barely slept. The puppy, wrapped in her old blanket, slept in the kitchen, occasionally making soft whimpers. Every sound, every breath made her wake up and get up to check if everything was okay. Around 3 in the morning, she couldn't take it anymore and brought her chair from the living room to sit next to it. In the dimly lit kitchen, illuminated only by the faint glow of a nightlight, Jennifer watched as this little bundle of life struggled with pain. She thought about how much it had already endured to be here and how its life now depended on her. In the morning, When the first rays of sunlight broke through the dirty window glass, Jennifer decided to take the puppy to the vet. She knew it would cost money she didn't have, but she saw no other way. She carefully placed the puppy in a woven basket, lining it with an old sweater to keep it warm, and slowly walked to her car. Her old Toyota started with a cough after a few attempts, but finally came to life. Jennifer prayed that the car would hold out for this trip. The vet clinic was 15 miles from her house, and the road there stretched through empty fields and occasional rows of trees that had already shed their leaves. When Jennifer entered the clinic, holding the basket with the puppy, she felt the gazes of everyone present on her. The administrator, a young woman with a short haircut and a friendly smile, immediately approached her. "How can we help?" she asked, glancing at the puppy with obvious concern. "I found him on the roadside yesterday. He was covered in blood, emaciated," Jennifer said, trying to keep the tremor out of her voice. "I don't know what's wrong with him, but I want you to examine him." The administrator nodded and gestured for her to enter the office. A moment later, the vet, a man in his 40s with a tired but kind expression, appeared. "Let's see what we have here," he said, carefully examining the puppy. He checked its eyes, ears, examined the wounds, and the broken paw. The puppy whimpered softly, but did not resist. Jennifer felt the anxiety growing in her chest. "He is severely emaciated," the vet began. "The broken paw requires fixation, possibly even surgery. And he has an ear infection and several deep scratches that need to be treated." Jennifer nodded, understanding that all this sounded like a sentence. "How much will it cost?" she asked, trying to appear calm, although inside everything was tightening with fear. The vet paused for a moment, then looked at her and gently said, "A full examination, treatment, and medication will cost about $300. If surgery is needed, it will be more expensive." These words struck her like thunder. $300? For someone, it might be a small amount. But for Jennifer, whose bank card had been at zero for several weeks, it seemed insurmountable. She lowered her eyes, pondering what to do. But then the puppy whimpered softly and pressed against her hand. This gesture, a simple movement, filled her heart with determination. "Do everything that's needed. I'll find the money," she said firmly. The vet nodded approvingly, and the administrator offered her to fill out the documents. While Jennifer sat in the waiting room, she tried to figure out where to get the money. Her head was filled with options. Borrow from neighbors, try to sell some things. But the most important thing for her now was to save this helpless puppy. A couple of hours later, the vet came out of the office. "We've treated his wounds, put a temporary splint on his paw, and given him medication for the infection. Now he needs as much rest as possible," he said. "Do you have a place at home where he can be warm and quiet?" "Yes, I'll arrange everything," Jennifer replied. She returned home with the basket in which the puppy was now sleeping. Its breathing had become more even, and for a moment, Jennifer felt that everything would be okay. She laid it on the old sofa in the living room, next to a bowl of water and a few soft rags. The puppy slightly opened its eyes and looked at her. This look, full of gratitude and trust, made her forget all her doubts. "You will live, little one," she said, stroking its head. That night, Jennifer felt for the first time in a long while that she had done something truly important. The next day, Jennifer woke up earlier than usual. The sun's rays filtered through the curtains, filling the room with warm golden light. The first thing she did was go to the sofa where the puppy was sleeping. It was curled up in a ball, its breathing steady and quiet. Jennifer noticed that its body no longer trembled as much as yesterday, and this filled her heart with relief. "Good morning, little one," she said softly, sitting down next to it. The puppy slightly raised its head, looked at her with its big brown eyes, and, to her surprise, weakly wagged its tail. This simple movement, so small and timid, made Jennifer smile. She reached out her hand, and the puppy cautiously licked her fingers. "It seems we're starting to understand each other," she said, feeling the warm connection that was forming between them. She filled a bowl with water and brought some chicken broth she had cooked especially for it. The puppy first sniffed the food cautiously, but, sensing the appetizing smell, eagerly began to lap it up. Jennifer watched it with a sense of pride. After breakfast, she decided to give it a name. She looked intently at its face, trying to find something in it that would help her make a choice. Lucas, she suddenly said aloud. You will be called Lucas. The puppy seemed to understand that this was now its name because it looked at her and weakly wagged its tail again. The first few days were filled with caring for Lucas. Jennifer read online articles about dog rehabilitation, consulted with a vet, and tried to do everything to make the puppy feel better. But these days did not pass without difficulties. Lucas had a strong fear of sudden movements and loud noises. Every time Jennifer accidentally dropped something on the floor or slammed a cabinet door, he would cringe and start trembling. It's okay, it's just noise, she would reassure him, sitting down next to him and gently stroking his head. One day, she tried to take him out into the yard so he could feel the fresh air. But as soon as they stepped outside, Lucas froze, his eyes wide with fear, and he desperately tried to get back inside. Jennifer did not insist, simply picked him up and returned to the house. You have your own past, right? She said softly, sitting down with him on the sofa. You're afraid of what was out there. Her words sounded unexpected even to herself. She couldn't help but notice how this puppy reflected her own fears. After the divorce from Douglas, she too was afraid to go outside, into the world where she had to rebuild her life. One evening, as the rain drummed on the roof, Jennifer sat with a cup of tea while Lucas dozed at her feet. She looked at him and thought about how much this little puppy had changed her life in the past few days. He reminded her that caring for another being could give life a new meaning. She began to feel that her days were no longer empty, that she now had a purpose. But not everyone in her life felt the same warmth toward Lucas. Her neighbor, Mrs. Green, an elderly woman known for her love of gossip, did not miss the opportunity to express her opinion. You're serious? Mrs. Green asked, peering over the fence as Jennifer once again carried Lucas in her arms into the yard. With your financial problems, you're taking on another burden? Jennifer clenched her teeth, trying not to show how much these words hurt her. This is not a burden, Mrs. Green, she replied firmly. This is life, and it deserves a chance. At that moment, she realized that not everyone would find it easy to explain her decision. But she didn't need to. Her bond with Lucas was growing deeper every day, and she began to see in him not just a puppy, but a part of her family. A few more days passed before Lucas took his first independent step toward trust. Jennifer, as usual, was sitting in the kitchen, leafing through an old cookbook when she felt a light touch at her foot. She looked down and saw Lucas standing next to her, looking at her and slightly wagging his tail. Good boy, Lucas, she smiled, leaning down to pet him. He licked her hand and then suddenly jumped on her lap. This was unexpected, but Jennifer felt her heart fill with warmth. You're starting to trust me, aren't you? She whispered, hugging him. This small step from Lucas was a huge achievement for her. She knew that there would be many more difficulties ahead, but now she felt that she and Lucas could handle anything as long as they were together. Days passed, and Lucas gradually adapted to life in Jennifer's home. His wounds began to heal, and although he still limped due to his broken paw, there was confidence in his movements. However, Jennifer noticed that certain things still caused him anxiety. Loud noises, dark corners, strangers. Every time someone approached the house or a door slammed loudly, Lucas would cringe, his body tensing into a ball, as if preparing for a blow. This bothered Jennifer. She increasingly wondered what this puppy had been through. Where did he come from? Who could be so cruel as to leave him bleeding on the roadside? One day, during another visit to the vet, Jennifer decided to ask. Drive west, she began as Lucas sat on the examination table, patiently waiting for his splint to be removed. Do you have any idea where Lucas might have come from? He seems so frightened. The doctor paused for a moment, looked at the puppy, and then back at Jennifer. To be honest, Ms. Rose, his behavior and injuries make me think he might have been involved in dog fighting. These words struck her like a hammer blow. Dog fighting, she repeated, feeling a mix of horror and anger rising within her. Yes, it's a cruel sport, if you can call it that. Animals are bred and trained to fight each other to the death, and people place bets. Sometimes puppies that aren't suitable for fighting are simply discarded. Jennifer looked at Lucas, who seemed to understand that he was the subject of the conversation. He pressed against her hand, his eyes filled with sadness. "So, he could have been one of those puppies?" she asked softly. Drive West nodded. "It's possible. His physical condition, behavior, everything points to him being either a victim of training or simply discarded as unwanted." These words left Jennifer in disarray. She had always known there was cruelty in the world, but thinking that someone could do this to a helpless puppy was unbearable for her. On the way home, she couldn't stop thinking about it. Every detail, every frightened look from Lucas now took on new meaning. She suddenly felt an enormous responsibility, not just for his physical recovery, but also to show him that the world could be kind. When they returned home, Jennifer set Lucas down on the floor, but he, as usual, followed her into the kitchen. She sat down next to him, looking into his eyes. "You will never know fear again," she said firmly, stroking his head. "I promise you." That evening, she began researching dogfighting. The internet was full of horrifying stories. Photos of mutilated animals, reports of raids on illegal farms, stories of rescued but forever traumatized dogs. These stories brought tears to her eyes, but also anger. She understood that she had to do something more than just care for Lucas. The next day, as she returned from the store, Jennifer noticed that Mrs. Green had approached her house. She was standing by the fence, intently watching Lucas, who was curiously looking out the window. "Is that your new pet?" Mrs. Green asked, her tone more accusatory than friendly. "Yes, this is Lucas," Jennifer replied briefly, trying not to engage in a long conversation. But Mrs. Green was not ready to leave. "I heard he's connected to those awful dog fights. You know, those kinds of dogs can be dangerous." These words stung Jennifer. "He's not dangerous. He's frightened and traumatized, and I will do everything to keep him safe," she replied, trying to stay calm. After this conversation, she realized that not everyone would understand her decision. But this did not stop her. On the contrary, it strengthened her resolve. In the following days, she reached out to the local animal protection organization to learn more about how to help other dogs affected by fighting. She began talking to volunteers and listening to their stories. She was particularly struck by the story of a man who had dedicated his life to saving dogs. "We can't change the past, but we can give them a chance at a better future," he said, and these words deeply resonated with Jennifer. Lucas became more than just a puppy to her. He became a symbol of the fight for justice. She decided that she would not stop until she found out the whole truth about what happened to him and helped other animals in the same situation. Lucas's past was no longer a mystery to her. It was his dark legacy. But Jennifer believed that together they could turn his fears into strength and his pain into hope. News that Jennifer Rose had taken in a puppy with a dark past quickly spread through the small town. In places like this, people never missed an opportunity to discuss other people's business, especially if it seemed unusual or controversial. Jennifer had anticipated this, but did not expect how much other people's talk could affect her life. First, with concern, an old acquaintance, Mrs. Green, appeared on her doorstep. This elderly woman, who lived across the street, was known for knowing everything about everyone. Hardly a day went by without her stopping to talk to someone by the fence or mentioning a coincidentally overheard story in the grocery store. "Jennifer, dear," she began as soon as she was on the porch, "I heard your puppy is connected to those awful dog fights." Jennifer, holding a broom she had just used to sweep leaves, sighed heavily. "That's true, Mrs. Green. Lucas was hurt, but now he's safe." The old woman's eyes narrowed, her face stern. "Are you sure that's safe for you? For us? Those kinds of dogs can be aggressive. Well, you know," she said, lowering her voice as if discussing a state secret. Jennifer looked at Lucas, who was watching the conversation from the window. His gaze was so soft, and his tail wagged slightly, as if he wanted to show that everything was okay. "He's not aggressive, Mrs. Green," Jennifer said firmly. "He's traumatized, scared, and I'm not going to abandon him just because someone thinks he's a threat." But the conversation with Mrs. Green was just the beginning. A few days later, Jennifer noticed that people in the local cafe were starting to avoid her. Usually, over a cup of coffee or a piece of pie, she would exchange a few words with the saleswoman, but lately, the woman just nodded curtly, not engaging in conversation. One day, as she was walking Lucas in the yard, Jennifer heard whispers from neighbors who had stopped on the sidewalk across from her house. They say she even took him to the vet. She must have spent a fortune, one voice whispered. Of course, she's all alone. She has nothing better to do, so she found herself a hobby, another added. These words hit Jennifer hard. She wanted to go out to the gate and tell them they knew nothing, that they were wrong. But instead, she just went back into the house, closing the door behind her. That evening, as she sat with Lucas in the kitchen, pondering how to deal with this pressure, the phone rang. On the other end was her older sister, Susan. Jennifer. Susan began with a hint of reproach in her voice. Are you okay? I heard you took in some problematic dog. That's not true, Susan, Jennifer replied, trying to suppress her anger. He's not problematic. He just needed help. But do you understand how this looks? You have enough on your plate. The house, money, and now this. You need to think about yourself. These words, though spoken out of concern, made Jennifer feel even more alone. She knew that many thought her decision was reckless, but deep down, she believed she was doing the right thing. Despite the pressure, Jennifer began to notice that Lucas was becoming her support. Every time she felt her strength waning, he would come to her, press his little head against her, and look at her as if he understood her pain. One morning, as Jennifer was walking Lucas in the local park, a woman in her 40s approached her. Her face seemed familiar, but Jennifer couldn't remember her name. Excuse me, are you Jennifer? The woman began, her voice gentle. Yes, that's me. I wanted to thank you for what you've done. I heard about your puppy, about what he's been through. My brother works in the police, and he's told me how hard it is to fight against such things. Jennifer was surprised by this confession. Thank you, she replied, feeling a spark of hope ignite within her. If you need help or support, don't hesitate to reach out. What you're doing is important, and not everyone has the courage for it. These words reminded Jennifer that, despite the criticism and judgment, there were people who saw her efforts and appreciated them. The next day, Jennifer decided to take a step toward her community. She posted on social media, telling Lucas's story, his injuries, and his hope for a better future. Every animal deserves a chance, she wrote. Lucas was discarded like an unwanted thing, but he became a part of my life and changed it. I know many think this is foolish, but perhaps it will remind someone that compassion is not weakness, but strength. The post quickly spread through the town, and within a few days, Jennifer began receiving messages of support. People offered help with food, money for treatment, and some even wanted to meet Lucas. Now she knew that her decision to save Lucas was not just an act of kindness. It was a way to change not only his life, but also people's attitudes toward problems they were used to ignoring. And though more challenges lay ahead, Jennifer was confident. She had the strength to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves. Jennifer sat at the kitchen table, leaning over her bills. Almost all of them were marked with red, urgent, or overdue stickers. She had started accumulating debts even before she took Lucas under her wing, but since then, expenses had only increased. Treating the puppy, medications, vet visits, all of it turned out to be much more expensive than she had anticipated. Lucas sat at her feet, as if sensing her worry. He looked up at her, his big brown eyes expressing sympathy. It's not your fault, little one, she said, trying to reassure herself as much as him. We'll figure it out. Her morning coffee had gone cold, and the sheets of numbers in front of her looked more like chaos than anything meaningful. Jennifer knew she had to make serious decisions. She had been avoiding calling the bank, but she couldn't put it off any longer. She picked up the phone and dialed the number. Good afternoon, this is Jennifer Rose, she began, trying to sound confident. I wanted to discuss the possibility of restructuring my mortgage. The operator was polite but dry. After a few minutes of waiting, Jennifer learned that her application for a payment deferral had been denied. Her only option was to find the money, and fast. Hanging up the phone, she felt a heaviness in her chest. Financial problems seemed insurmountable. But when she looked at Lucas, curled up at her feet, she felt a clear understanding. Giving up was not an option. The next day, Jennifer decided to sell some of the things that had been gathering dust. She pulled out boxes of dishes, old books, and clothes from the closet. Many of these items reminded her of her past life. Porcelain plates she and Douglas had bought for their first anniversary, books he had given her for Christmas. "They're just things," she whispered to herself, packing them into boxes. Something more important is at stake now. At the local flea market, Jennifer set up her goods on a small makeshift stand. People came, looked at the items, and some asked questions. "Are you getting rid of all this?" asked one of her former colleagues, holding an old cookbook. "Yes," Jennifer replied with a smile, though she felt emptied inside. The sale went better than she had expected. People bought almost everything she had brought, and though the amount was far from her total debt, it still gave her a sense of relief. But even that money wasn't enough to cover the next vet visit. A week later, Jennifer was sitting in the clinic, waiting for Drive West to examine Lucas. "His paw is healing well," the vet said, removing the splint. "But he'll need a few more procedures to fully recover." Jennifer nodded, trying to hide her concern. "How much will that cost?" she asked, her hands clenched. Drive West paused for a moment, then looked at her with gentle sympathy. "We can give you a discount on the next procedure, but even with that, it will be around $150. She thanked him, though her mind was already racing to find a solution. That evening, Jennifer sat down at her computer again to find a side job. She already taught private music lessons, but that wasn't enough. Now she was looking for something she could do from home. After a few hours of searching, she came across an ad for editing text for the local newspaper. The job was temporary, but it could give her a chance to stabilize the situation. Jennifer immediately sent her resume and, the very next day, received an invitation for an interview. When she arrived at the office, she was greeted by the editor-in-chief, a man in his 50s with a friendly smile. "Ms. Rose, haven't we met before?" he asked, shaking her hand. "Possibly," she replied with a smile. "I used to teach at the local school, but that was a long time ago." The editor turned out to be more understanding than she had expected. He listened to her attentively, reviewed samples of her work, and offered her a temporary contract. "We just need someone to work on local stories," he said. "Small reports, personal stories. I think you can handle it." This news was a ray of hope for Jennifer. She returned home, feeling that her efforts were finally beginning to pay off. Meanwhile, Lucas continued to remind her why she was doing all this. Every day he became more confident, his tail wagged more often, and his eyes were no longer so sad. One evening, as Jennifer was filling out her first article for the newspaper, Lucas came up to her and laid his head on her lap. She put her laptop aside and stroked his head. "We'll make it," she said, more to herself than to him. She knew that more challenges lay ahead, but now she had a goal that drove her forward. The financial burden still hung over her head, but she wouldn't let it crush her resolve. Jennifer realized that her struggle was not just about money. It was about proving to herself and others that compassion and perseverance could overcome any obstacle. Time passed, and Lucas gradually recovered. His paw healed, his fur became shiny, and on walks he began to act more confidently. Though he still feared loud noises and strangers, his tail wagged more often, and his eyes shone with childlike curiosity. Jennifer, absorbed in her daily cares, continued to work on articles for the local newspaper. Her new source of income, though small, allowed her to cover part of Lucas's treatment costs and gradually improve her debt situation. She found unexpected joy in this work, telling stories about ordinary people, their worries, victories, and difficulties. One morning, when they went to the park, she felt for the first time that their joint efforts were beginning to bear fruit. The weather was warm, the sun's rays filtered through the treetops, and a light breeze brought the scent of wet grass. Lucas sniffed everything around him with interest, his tail wagging, and his paws stepping confidently along the path. At one point, he suddenly stopped, his ears perked up. Jennifer froze, not knowing what had caught his attention. From behind the bushes, another dog jumped out, a golden retriever, just as energetic and happy as the sunny day itself. Lucas first pressed himself to the ground, warily watching the new acquaintance. But the retriever, not noticing his fear, happily approached and began to sniff him. "Come on, Lucas, it's okay," Jennifer said softly, sitting down next to him. She saw how his tense muscles gradually relaxed, and finally, he took a tentative step toward the retriever. His tail began to wag, and within a few minutes, they were playing, chasing each other. For Jennifer, this was a small but significant victory. Lucas was finally beginning to trust not only her, but others as well. This moment filled her heart with pride and joy. "Good boy," she said when Lucas returned to her, his tongue hanging out from exhaustion, his eyes shining with happiness. That same evening, inspired by the success, Jennifer decided to write an article about Lucas. It was her personal story, but she knew it could inspire others. She described the day she found him on the roadside, his difficult journey to recovery, the fears he overcame, and the joy he brought into her life. "Lucas taught me that every living being deserves a second chance. We often think our efforts are insignificant, but sometimes one kind act can change an entire life," she wrote in conclusion. The article was published in the next issue of the newspaper, and responses did not take long. The next day, Jennifer received several letters and messages. People wrote to her with words of support, shared their own stories of rescuing animals, offered help, or simply thanked her for raising an important issue. One of the messages particularly touched her. An elderly woman named Mary wrote, "Ms. Rose, I read your article and couldn't hold back tears. A few years ago, I also took in a dog I found on the street. She became my only comfort after my husband's death. Thank you for reminding us all how important it is to care for those who can't stand up for themselves." These words filled Jennifer with inspiration. She realized that her story with Lucas had become more than just her personal experience. It was an opportunity to change people's views, to inspire them to do good deeds. A few days later, Jennifer received an unexpected invitation to speak at a local meeting of the Animal Protection Organization. They asked her to talk about Lucas and how she copes with the challenges. The meeting took place in a small room on the outskirts of town. The room was filled with volunteers, activists, and simply caring people. Jennifer felt a slight nervousness, but when she stood before the audience, she saw faces filled with genuine interest. She told them about how she found Lucas, his injuries and fears, how hard it was to find the money for treatment, and how he gradually overcame his fears. "Every time I look at Lucas, I see not just a dog. I see the strength that overcomes pain, and this strength inspires me to keep going," she said in conclusion. The audience greeted her words with applause. After the meeting, several people approached her, offering help. Some wanted to donate money. Others offered food and medicine for Lucas, and some simply expressed their gratitude. For Jennifer, this was her first real success. She felt that her efforts were beginning to bear fruit. She no longer felt alone in her struggle. People were starting to see her story, to understand her, to support her. When she and Lucas returned home, she couldn't help but notice how he had changed. His steps were confident, his gaze calm, and his tail never stopped wagging. "We're a team, Lucas," she said, stroking his head. That day was a reminder for her that even small steps could lead to big changes. And she knew that their journey was just beginning. Several weeks had passed since Jennifer published the article about Lucas and spoke at the Animal Protection Organization meeting. It seemed that everything was starting to fall into place. Lucas was becoming more confident, and her work at the newspaper was bringing in a steady income. But the calm was temporary. One morning, when Jennifer returned home from the grocery store, she noticed something strange. The gate to her yard was ajar. She clearly remembered closing it when she left the house. Feeling uneasy, she quickly set the bags down on the steps and rushed into the yard. "Lucas!" she called, her voice louder than usual. From inside the house came a soft, frightened bark. She hurried inside. Lucas was sitting in the corner of the kitchen, his body trembling, his eyes wide with fear. Jennifer rushed to him, gently embracing him. "It's okay, little one. I'm here," she whispered, stroking his head. Carefully surveying the house, she didn't notice anything out of place. Everything was where it should be. But something told her this wasn't an accident. Her suspicions were confirmed the next day. As she was walking Lucas in the park, a stranger approached her. His appearance was sharp, short-cropped hair, dark sunglasses, broad shoulders. He looked at Lucas with a cold smirk. "Nice dog," he said, coming closer. Jennifer tensed, pulling the leash closer to herself. "Thank you," she replied, trying to sound confident. "Looks like he's been through a lot," the man continued, his gaze becoming more piercing. "I wonder how he ended up with you?" "That's none of your business," Jennifer replied curtly and took a step to the side to leave. But the man wasn't ready to just walk away. I think we could come to an agreement. This dog is worth money. Maybe you'd like to sell him?" These words made Jennifer stop. She turned around, feeling anger rise within her. "Lucas is not for sale. He's a member of my family, and if you come near us again, I'll call the police," she said, looking straight into his eyes. The man shrugged, smirking. "Your call, ma'am. But if I were you, I'd think twice." He turned and walked away, leaving Jennifer with a heavy feeling of fear. That night, she couldn't sleep. Every rustle, every sound outside the window made her jump. She couldn't stop thinking about the man from the park. Who was he? How did he know about Lucas? The next day, she decided to seek help. She called the animal protection organization she had recently started working with. The organization's leader, a woman named Sarah, listened carefully to her story. "Jennifer, this could be dangerous. If Lucas is really connected to illegal dog fights, those who used him might try to get him back. Those kinds of people don't like it when their business is disrupted," Sarah said. These words only intensified her anxiety. "What should I do?" Jennifer asked, feeling her voice tremble. "First, make sure your home is secure. Put locks on the gates, check the doors and windows. Second, we can involve the local police. If you suspect someone is watching you, it needs to be documented." Jennifer nodded, though she didn't want to involve the police. She had always tried to avoid confrontation, but now she understood that it was not just about her safety, but Lucas's as well. The next day, she began to fortify her home. She closed the gates, added extra locks to the door, and installed cameras, bought with her last savings. All of this became necessary for her. She even set up a new lighting system in the yard so that everything was well lit at night. But despite all the measures, the fear did not leave her. She felt as if someone was watching her, as if her every move was being monitored. One evening, she noticed a black car slowly driving past her house. It didn't stop, but something about its movement seemed suspicious to her. Jennifer decided she couldn't delay any longer. She called the police and told them about the man in the park and the strange incidents around her house. The officer she spoke to assured her that they would patrol her neighborhood and keep an eye on the situation. A few days later, her fears were confirmed. Returning home from work, Jennifer noticed that the gate was open again. This time, there were muddy footprints in the yard leading to her door. Lucas greeted her with loud barking, which was unusual for him. She called the police, and officers arrived within a few minutes. They inspected her house, but found nothing. "Someone is clearly trying to scare you," one of the officers said, looking at the footprints. "We'll increase patrols, but you should be careful." These events only strengthened Jennifer's resolve to protect Lucas. She knew that her decision to save him and give him a second chance had turned out to be much more complicated than she could have imagined. But she was not going to give up. Lucas seemed to sense her tension. He became even more attached to her, following her around the house and often lying at her feet, as if to show he was always there. "We'll be okay, Lucas," she said softly, sitting next to him on the sofa. "I won't let anyone hurt you." There was determination in her voice, a determination she hadn't known she had. Despite the fear, despite the threats, she was ready to fight for her little friend. Because Lucas had become more than just a dog to her. He was a symbol of hope and strength that she had found because of him. After recent events, Jennifer's life had turned into an endless cycle of tension and anxiety. Every night, she woke up from the slightest sound, checking doors and windows, and Lucas, sensing her state, did not leave her side. Although police patrols promised to watch her house, she felt vulnerable. However, despite her fears, Jennifer was not going to give up. She realized that she needed help and support. Deciding to act, she turned to Sarah from the animal protection organization she had recently collaborated with. "Sarah, I need your help," she said over the phone, trying to speak calmly, although everything inside her was trembling. Sarah suggested meeting in their office, located in an old brick building in the city center, and even become part of a committee that dealt with animal protection issues. But most importantly, she felt that she was no longer afraid. She knew she had found the strength within herself to face any challenge. One day, returning home from a meeting with volunteers, she saw Lucas standing at the door, waiting for her. His tail was wagging, and his eyes were shining with joy. "You're my hero, Lucas," she said, hugging him. "Thanks to you, I found myself." Now Jennifer knew that her life would never be the same. She decided to dedicate herself to fighting for those who could not stand up for themselves, and every day she reminded herself, every action, no matter how small, made a difference. And although more work awaited her, she was ready to continue the fight, knowing that her efforts were making the world a little kinder. After the conference, Jennifer's life took on a completely new rhythm. Her speech had caused a wide public resonance, and her story had inspired many people to take action. Newspapers began publishing articles about the problem of animal cruelty. Local television stations made reports about the work of shelters, and the police intensified control over suspicious facilities where dog fights might be taking place. But most importantly for Jennifer, it was not just attention to the problem, but real changes that began to happen around her. A month after the raid on the warehouse, Jennifer received an invitation to a meeting with the city council. There, they were to discuss an initiative to toughen laws against dog fights and increase funding for local shelters. She had never participated in such events, but she understood that her voice could be important. In the meeting hall, city officials, activists, journalists, and residents gathered. Sarah accompanied Jennifer, supporting her with her presence. When it was her turn to speak, Jennifer felt a lump in her throat. She looked at Sarah, who nodded to her with an encouraging smile. This gave her strength. "Good afternoon," she began, trying to make her voice sound firm. "My name is Jennifer Rose, and I am here to tell you why these changes are necessary." She described her journey in detail, how she found Lucas, what he went through, and the dangers they faced along the way. "We cannot allow this cruelty to continue," she said, addressing those present. "These animals depend on us, on our kindness and determination. If we do not take action, no one will." Her speech was met with thunderous applause. City council members listened attentively, and some of them asked questions to better understand what changes were truly necessary. As a result of the meeting, it was decided to create a working group that would develop new legislative proposals. Jennifer was offered to join it, and she agreed. Meanwhile, her work at the shelter continued. The rescued dogs, who had been taken from the warehouse, were gradually recovering. Some of them found new homes, and those who needed long-term rehabilitation remained under the care of volunteers. One day, while visiting the shelter, Jennifer noticed one of the dogs she had seen on the day of the raid approaching her. This young dog with dark fur and a wary look in his eyes was now less hesitant to approach people. "Hi there," Jennifer said, crouching down next to him. The dog cautiously sniffed her hand and then, unexpectedly, licked her fingers. This was a small but important sign of trust. "He's starting to change," Sarah said, watching them. "These moments remind us why we do what we do." Over the next few months, Jennifer actively participated in the development of new initiatives. She wrote articles, gave speeches on local radio and television, and organized fundraisers for shelters. Thanks to her efforts, more volunteers were attracted, and some business people began supporting animal aid programs. But what was most important to her was the change in people. On the street, strangers often approached her to thank her or share their stories. "We adopted a dog from the shelter after reading your article," a young couple once told her in the park. "Thank you for inspiring us." These words filled her heart with joy. She saw how her story was changing people's attitudes and giving her strength. However, working on changes required a lot of time and effort. Jennifer often felt tired, But every time she returned home and saw Lucas, she remembered why she had started this journey. Lucas had become a symbol of her struggle. He was not just a dog. He was a friend who reminded her of why she had begun this path. A year had passed since the beginning of her struggle, and the city held a major charity event in support of shelters. Jennifer was one of the organizers. At the event, hundreds of people gathered. Families with children, volunteers, business representatives, and city officials. One of the main events of the action was the signing of a new bill that tightened penalties for dog fights and allocated additional funds to support shelters. When Jennifer took the stage to thank everyone for their support, she felt pride in her voice. "This is our common victory," she said. "Each of you has contributed to this change. Thank you for showing that kindness and compassion can change the world." That evening, sitting at home with Lucas, Jennifer remembered everything they had been through. She thought about the difficulties that seemed insurmountable and how they had become stronger because of them. "We did it, buddy," she said softly, stroking his head. Her life was now filled with meaning. She no longer felt alone or lost. Her story with Lucas had become part of something bigger, a movement for justice and kindness that continued to grow every day. And although more work awaited her, she was ready to continue. For she saw that changes were possible if one believed and acted. Several more months passed, and Jennifer's life had changed completely. The rehabilitation center, opened thanks to her efforts, had become a true refuge for animals. Every day, she saw how broken and traumatized creatures regained their trust in people, and sometimes even found their forever homes. But her greatest achievement remained Lucas. He was not only her friend, but also a symbol of everything she had accomplished. His story continued to inspire people throughout the city and even beyond. One winter morning, when the first rays of the sun broke through the gray clouds, Jennifer sat in her office at the center. On the table in front of her lay a stack of letters. Many of them were expressions of gratitude from people whose lives had changed thanks to her work. She picked up one letter. It was from a teenager named Michael, who had recently adopted a dog from their center. "Dear Ms. Rose, my name is Michael. I am 16 years old, and I wanted to thank you. Recently, I took a dog named Charlie from your center. He was scared, but now he has become my best friend. I was lonely after losing my father, but Charlie helped me feel that I am not alone again. Thank you for giving us a chance to find each other." Reading this letter, Jennifer felt tears well up in her eyes. Such stories reminded her why she had started this journey. Later that day, she went to the dog exercise area to interact with the new residents of the center. There, she noticed a small puppy who was hiding in a corner. His fur was disheveled, and his eyes were full of fear. "Hi there," Jennifer said, crouching down next to him. The puppy looked at her warily, but did not back away. Jennifer held out her hand, holding a piece of food, and a few minutes later, the puppy cautiously approached her. "You'll have a good chance, I promise," she said, stroking his head. Her days were now filled with work with animals, but Jennifer also continued to share her story. She was invited to speak at a national conference on animal protection, where she told how one little puppy had changed her life. "I started this journey not knowing what awaited me," she said in her speech. "But I realized that each of us is capable of more than we think. When we decide to fight for those who cannot stand up for themselves, we become stronger and kinder." Her words were met with thunderous applause, and afterward, dozens of people approached her to express their gratitude and support. However, the true culmination of her work came the day Lucas officially became the center's therapy dog. His calm and friendly nature made him ideal for working with children and adults who had experienced difficulties. One day, a group of school children visited the center. Among them was a little girl named Emma, who had recently undergone a difficult operation and was very withdrawn. When Lucas approached her, she was initially frightened, but then she reached out her hand to pet him. "He's good," she said softly, looking at Jennifer. "He's the best," Jennifer replied with a smile. This moment showed her how far she and Lucas had come. That evening, returning home, Jennifer reflected on how her life had changed. Just a few years ago, she had felt lost, not knowing what to do next. But now she had a purpose that filled her every day with meaning. Lucas, as always, settled down next to her, his head resting on her lap. "You gave me more than just friendship," she said, looking at him. "You gave me a new life." Now her days were spent not only working with animals, but also communicating with people who came to her for help. She saw how her efforts inspired others, how people's lives changed thanks to the dogs they adopted from the center. One day, someone asked her, "What is the most important thing for you in this work?" Jennifer thought and replied, "Seeing how love changes everything. These animals have experienced the worst, but they still trust us. And this is a reminder that we too can become better." Several more months passed, and Jennifer decided to take another step forward. She began working on a book in which she wanted to tell the story of Lucas and their shared journey. "This will not be just a book," she told Sarah. "It will be an inspiration for those who think their efforts don't matter." Her book became a symbol of everything she had achieved. And although it was not yet finished, Jennifer felt that she had already done the most important thing. She had found her voice and used it to help others. That evening, sitting on the porch of her house, Jennifer looked at the setting sun. As always, Lucas was by her side. "We did it," she said softly, stroking his head. Now her life was full. She knew that their story was just beginning and that there was still much work ahead. But with Lucas by her side, she was ready for anything. Her path had been filled with difficulties, but each one had made her stronger. And now she knew, when you act with love, you can change the world.